Forget Clint Eastwood, forget John Wayne, forget whatever the hell this was. The greatest lawman in the history of the Wild West looked more like this.
My man.
Yeah, a freed slave worked his way up to be a deputy U.S. Marshal who made over 3,000 arrests in 30 years and has more kills than Elon Musk has baby mamas. Not by a lot though, because that's a tough number to beat, I'm not gonna lie. Seriously though, here's a clip of an acclaimed historian describing this very man.
Straight dog!
Yeah, my brother was maybe the greatest lawman in history, and this is true. When he was active, criminals turned themselves in because they were too scared he would come after them. And his name, of course, I can only be talking about the man, the myth, the legend himself.
My name is Jeff.
I just had to ruin the epic intro. I'm sorry. His name was... Baby Reeves was born into slavery in July 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. His grandfather was Bass Washington, and because when you already have the second coolest male name after Don running in your family, you don't change it. Because of that, he was named Bass. And since the slave owner who owned Bass and his family went by the name of William Steele Reeves, Bass's full name technically was Bass Steele Reeves. What? How cool is that name? Please, I need some comments on the coolest names in history. I need to know if anything can top Bass Steele Reeves. Also, if any future male hoping to make his name in the adult performance industry is watching this, you're welcome. To be honest, I got carried away. There's no record of him actually adopting the slave owner's Steele name. But hey, you can, and a glorious career in the adult industry awaits you. By the age of 8, young slave Bass found himself working as a stable hand in Grayson County, and because slave child laborers back then were only complete with 2 jobs, he was also a blacksmith apprentice at the age of 8, until he grew into a full adult frame of 188 centimeters at a time when the average height was 172 centimeters. And if you use the imperial system, well, first of all, why the hell is that still a thing? But it's not your fault. So here you go. That would be 6'2" at a time when the average height was 5'6". So Bass Reeves was a big dude with a big mustache and some serious muscle. You know, the type of guy women want to be with, and the type of guy where men wonder, what's that brother gotta do to get some steel like you? Well, I asked him.
You want steel like me? Well, it ain't gonna be easy. I've been through a lot, and I've earned my strength, but if you're willing to put in the work, I can show you the way.
Yep, I bet you didn't know that you could chat with Bass Reeves, did you? But all you gotta do is download Holy Bass from the link in my bio, and you'll have access to a bunch of historical characters to chat with, not just Bass. Say, you want to talk to Napoleon Bonaparte? He's right there, waiting for you to chat with him.
Bonjour.
Well, pardon my French, but I'll be damned.
Basically, any character you can think of, he, she, them, it, they, tree, Pokemon, they're all in the app, and you can also create your own character, like I did with Bass. It's super simple, but super customizable at the same time, and all of this is free, which is great because, you know,
I'm broke, baby. I ain't got no money.
But there is a premium version with some extra features which you also get for free if you click the link in my description to download Polybus and use the code BRIEF55 with a capital B. And there's like 10 million users on the app, and I don't know, 20 million characters that you can chat with. I mean,
Are you not entertained?
just download Polybus and use the code BRIEF55. And by doing that, you also legit support this channel, because sponsors like Polybus, they allow me to keep making these videos, so show them some love. But back to the real Bass Reeves. As I said, the man was a beast, standing tall at 190 centimeters, and Bass Reeves himself was once quoted as saying that he needs a special horse because, and I quote, "When you get as big as me, a small horse is as worthless as a preacher in a whiskey joint fight." Also, oddly enough, there are numerous historical references that he had very large hands. So, ladies, a man named Bass Reeves with very large hands, you're welcome.
Naughty America.
But all that height and muscle did was promote him from a farmhand slave to becoming the body servant to his master's son, George Reeves. And while body servant sounds like a description straight out of Diddy's Grindr profile, it actually just means he was George Reeves' companion, butler, bodyguard, his squire, if you will. And while now slaving for George, Bass asked him if he could please allow him to learn how to read. But George said no and allowed him to learn how to handle a gun instead. Funny that they're more worried about an oppressed person getting an education than learning how to use a gun. Yeah, this is relevant social commentary for the times we live in. In fact, Bass became such a good shot that George Reeves frequently entered him in prize shooting contests to make some more money off his slave, and Bass won so often that he was eventually banned from participating. Now, this George Reeves, he actually was so much about that racist life that he was willing to go to war to keep his slaves. So when the American Civil War rolled around, George Reeves fought for the Confederacy. And if you don't use the imperial system, there's a chance you might not be too familiar with the American Civil War. So, in a nutshell, half of America decided that slavery is not so great anymore and called themselves the Union Army, fought against the other half of America, the Confederacy, who really liked themselves some slaves, and thus America was divided and went to war over whether to be racist or not. So basically modern America within a year or two. George Reeves was actively fighting against his slave Bass Reeves' freedom, while Bass Reeves had to serve as a body servant in the war, helping his master with whatever he needs to fight against Bass's freedom. That's twisted. And you'd think that's a good reason for Bass to tell George to suck his steel, but nah. Bass Reeves was a man of an odd sense of duty and loyalty, and Bass later himself claimed that during the Civil War he even followed George into 3 battles against the people who were trying to free him. But then George, who had since become a colonel in the Confederate Army, then he went too far. Then he did the unthinkable, a thing that no amount of loyalty or sense of duty could accept. George cheated while playing cards with Bass.
Unforgivable.
So Bass Reeves got up from the table, flipped it over, cards and all, and punched his master in the face and said,
You got knocked the f*** out!
And then he probably ran away like hell because he just punched the colonel of the pro-slaves army in the face while in pro-slaves territory, which had introduced many black necks to nooses for much less. And so Bass Reeves fled into the nearest native territory in what is now known as Oklahoma, but which I like to call
Captain Deadpool. No, just Deadpool, yeah.
which I guess needs some explanation. So here is why I call the lands now known as Oklahoma the Deadpool. After the Europeans were done stealing all of America from the natives, they eventually decided to just send them all to live in one part of America, a part we now know as Oklahoma. The natives were quite literally and sadly pulled into these lands to die, hence why I call it the death pool. All of the remaining natives in the lands, people from 60 different tribes, were relocated here and left to die or live, whatever, as long as they were separate from the rest of America in a sort of out of sight, out of mind situation. This whole genocidal process is now historically known as the Trail of Tears. So, since the colonizers didn't care enough to establish any sort of law here, the natives organized themselves and established their own laws and their own police force within the death pool. But since they were natives and considered inferior by the people who stole their lands, their jurisdiction ended with other natives. They were only allowed to try their own people for crimes against their own people. And that, in other words, means any white person who commits a crime within the death pool cannot be punished by the law. So obviously, that's paradise for anyone running from the law in the rest of America, and before long, the death pool became home to all kinds of bandits and outlaws, to the point where, out of all the white people who called this territory home, only 25% were non-criminal, law-abiding citizens. And that's the story of. This is where Bass Reeves sought refuge after knocking out his former slave master, and he was welcomed. He was welcomed by the natives. He lived amongst their tribes peacefully for long enough to become fluent in some of their languages, learned how to hunt and ride a horse like them, and eventually he joined an army unit of natives and former slaves that fought for the Union against the Confederacy. But to be precise, this slave and natives only unit was formed to specifically hunt down natives who were aiding and fighting for the Confederacy. Yeah, there were actually oppressed people who chose to fight on the side of and supported their racist oppressors for the sake of some personal or political gain. Imagine that.
Can you believe that?
He's a jackass.
By 1865, the war was over. The Union won, but slavery had already been abolished in 1863, actually, and that had officially made Bass Reeves a free man. And since all he knew was to farm and kill, he became a farmer and a killer in the name of the law. Let's discuss the farming part first. Bass Reeves returned to Arkansas, set up a farm, met and married Nellie Jenny, a Texan woman. So, she liked things big, and she loved Bass Steel so much that they had 10 children together. Now, that sounds like happily ever after, but remember that we're talking about the South here. This was the land of the former Confederacy soldiers who had literally just lost a war to keep their slaves, and now this former slave was setting up a farm in their backyard.
Unforgivable.
So even though the war for the freedom of all slaves was won, peace for former slaves in the South only existed for as long as Union troops occupied the South and kept that peace. Once they left, the former slave owners quickly organized themselves and regained power, rescinding many of the rights black people had been given since the war. Black people were forbidden to vote, forbidden to testify against white people in court, forbidden to enroll in school, forbidden to travel freely, forbidden to disobey orders, and forbidden to leave a job without permission. And if any black person did travel alone, they could be arrested and sentenced to forced labor, aka they were slaves again, just with a different name. These laws and others enforcing racial segregation became known as the Jim Crow laws, and the separation between European Americans and African Americans was violently enforced by various white supremacy organizations, most famous of all, the Ku Klux Klan. And down in the South, it was not uncommon to see a black person swinging from a noose on a tree or killed in a more violently creative manner for petty crime or an entirely made-up crime. Slavery was officially outlawed, but the lives of black people weren't exactly blissful. So this is what Bass Reeves and his black family of 12 called home. But it turns out that Bass Reeves had a very particular talent that made him a very important man.
I'm the best there is at what I do. And what I do.
You got it. Go ahead.
I'm the best there is at what I do. But what I do isn't very nice.
The dead pool and its status as a safe haven and refuge for outlaws and bandits was becoming a problem. And the government wanted to bring these people to justice. So they assigned Judge Isaac Parker to do it. And all you really need to know about Judge Isaac Parker is that he was known as the hanging judge. Two guesses as to why he was called that. Yeah, because dude was packed. I mean, this thing was He liked to hang people. Because criminals don't usually come willingly to their own hanging, Judge Isaac Parker needed a bunch of deputy U.S. Marshals to enforce the law for him. So he appointed 200 deputy U.S. Marshals to go into the dead pool and try their best to make it out alive. Again, remember that this was no man's land. There was no law in the dead pool except for the unlucky men of law who were sent there against an overwhelming number of outlaws, bandits, natives, none of whom were fans of U.S. deputy marshals, but all of whom knew these lands better than the invading policemen, and all of whom agreed that if you wore a uniform, you're a target. Going in there as a lawman was suicide. But there was one man who had called the dead pool home for years, who spoke the languages of the natives, and who just so happened to also be a 6'2" war veteran with a shot so deadly that he won so many shooting contests that they had to ban him. And his name was
Jeff.
This was Bass Reeves' time to shine. He was made a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1875 and thus began the greatest career of any lawman ever. Now, you really gotta picture this almost 190 centimeters tall black giant wearing black boots and a black hat with a serious mustache, who had muscles hardened from working on a farm ever since he was 8, was lifting heavy metal as a blacksmith apprentice ever since his teenage years, was a prize-winning sharpshooter, served during the Civil War, learned how to hunt from the natives, how to handle any weapon off horseback, and on top of all those physical abilities, the man spoke several languages and knew how to track his prey in the wild. This man was now an agent of the law and hunting down criminals. Bass Reeves was basically like the first super agent. Seriously, dude was an absolute machine. And with all those tools at his disposal, he served as a deputy U.S. Marshal from 1875 to 1907 and made over 3,000 arrests. That's almost 100 arrests per year. And I really want you to think about that. About 8 arrests per month in the dead pool. An area so vicious that the law was scared to touch it for the longest time. An area where bandits bounty hunt lawmen. That is what Bass Reeves called his workplace for 32 years, and where he managed to make 100 arrests every single year without ever being seriously injured, but instead putting an estimated 14 to 20 men 6 foot under, which not only makes him the most successful lawman of his time, but also the deadliest. But you want specifics. You want examples of his arrests, of his shootouts. Of course, I understand. So let's go over some of Bass Reeves' greatest hits. Like this one time.
I'm at band camp.
Bass Reeves has an arrest warrant for an outlaw gang consisting of 3 brothers. Outlaws known as the Brunter brothers, Bill, Joe, and Jake Brunter. In fact, Bass Reeves didn't only have a warrant for them. He would frequently carry around several warrants, going into the dead pool and sometimes coming out of there with as many as 17 prisoners chained up behind his wagon, dragged back to their sentence. So this particular time, Bass Reeves was working on any one of his warrants when he was ambushed at camp by 3 men who held him up at gunpoint. As the leader held his gun to Bass Reeves' head, Bass recognized the 3 men. They were the 3 brothers whose arrest warrant he also happened to be carrying around. They were the Brunter brothers. And the Brunter brothers, they also recognized him. He was Bass Reeves. He was said to come in and out of the death pool like some immortal lawman, and word had it that sometimes he dragged as many as 17 outlaws back to their sentence, and yet here was, held at gunpoint, about to die. What a joke. But Bass Reeves, a veteran of countless life or death situations, didn't find it a particularly funny joke and just asked the 3 brothers a simple question. Say, what's today's date? Why would a dying man need to know the date? Well, I have to date your arrest warrant if I want to bring you in. Yeah, like a bad movie. Bass Reeves spat the coldest line, and like some bad movie villains, all 3 brothers started laughing, or at least the one holding the gun at Bass Reeves was amused enough that he lost focus for long enough that Bass Reeves could use that moment to push his gun away, quick drew his own revolver and shot the 3 brothers. And then he dated their arrest warrants and brought them in, dead rather than alive. Bass Reeves has an arrest warrant for 2 horse wrestlers, which is just old English for horse thieves, and their names were Frank Buck and John Bruner. While Bass is looking for these 2 outlaws, he finds himself in parts of the territory that even he is unfamiliar with. So he hires these 2 local guides to help him find Frank Buck and John Bruner. The 2 guides agreed to help, but just would ask Bass Reeves to pay them fairly for helping him on such a dangerous mission. The 3 come to an agreement, and his new helpers guide Bass Reeves towards the last known location of the 2 criminals. Eventually night falls and the trio has to rest, and as Bass Reeves prepares his dinner, he notices one of the guides reaching for his revolver. Bass immediately goes into Matrix mode. He jumps towards the man before he can pull the trigger, then aims his firing arm towards his accomplice so that when he does pull the trigger and get a shot off, he shoots his own man. Then Bass Reeves pulls out his own revolver and finishes the man off. The 2 dead guides turn out to be the wanted horse wrestlers Frank Buck and John Bruner. Two wanted outlaws were hiding out in their mother's cabin in the middle of nowhere, an open terrain, so you can see people coming from miles away, and it's impossible to approach for even a group of lawmen without taking heavy damage. Yet here, Bass Reeves and his group of lawmen were needing to approach to arrest these 2 criminals that they were hunting, and Bass Reeves had an idea. He ditched his uniform, put on a pair of dirty shoes, dirty rags, a hat with bullet holes in it, and walked 28 miles to the cabin to arrive entirely starved, thirsty, dirty, fatigued, and looking exactly like the outlaw on the run he wanted to look like. He knocked on the cabin door, and the woman who owns the house opens up, believes the story, and is happy to help another outlaw on the run, for she's already giving shelter to her 2 sons, renowned outlaws of their own. And the sons even take a liking to this black outlaw once they meet him. Any enemy of the law is a friend of theirs, and besides, their group of outlaws could use the help of a man of his physical stature with hands this big. The 3 trade outlaw stories become friends, and then the 2 outlaws and their mother go to sleep peacefully with not a worry in the world. And at night, Bass Reeves handcuffs them in their sleep and drags them out the cabin towards their sentence. A man murdered his wife and is on the run. The man's name is Benjamin Reeves. He is the son of Bass Reeves. The U.S. Marshal asks which deputy wants to take the case where there is no way he can send his star deputy to chase down his own son. 63-year-old veteran Bass Reeves volunteers to take the case. He chases down his own son and brings him to justice. That is Bass Reeves. I told you in the beginning of this video that the man is a straight up down. And also, man got paid. Dude reportedly once made $5,000 in a year, which is about $150,000 today. And still, despite his success, despite his reputation, despite his wealth, Bass Reeves still had racism to deal with. Many of his white colleagues within law enforcement thought that this black man was beneath them. And even when Bass Reeves ordered white prisoners around, they would take the prisoner's side and try to pick fights with Bass. They hated the fact that Bass Reeves was so successful and had this reputation of an incorruptible, undefeatable lawman, that he was legit this living legend. I mean, the dude was so feared by criminals that Jerry McIntosh got drunk, angry, and decided to drag his wife out of bed, beat her up, cover her in oil, and set her on fire. She didn't die, but
She doesn't care what you low. Oh,
Do you like what you see?
no. You look like an avocado. Had sex with an older, more disgusting avocado.
Yeah.
Not gently, like it was hateful. There was something wrong with the relationship, and that was the only catharsis that they could find without violence.
McIntosh then ran away. But while he was on the run, he had a dream that Bass Reeves would come for him. And so he decided to turn himself in voluntarily. Instead, again, Bass Reeves.
Dog.
Rumor even has it that years later, the famous hero stories of the Lone Ranger were based on Bass Reeves. But that fact is as disputed as it is sad that they then made this Lone Ranger white. Whatever the case though, black Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, he was a star. And that made him a target to be shot down in America that was not used to the idea of a free black man yet. So when a former Confederacy soldier ascended to the position of U.S. Attorney General in 1886, a racially motivated witch hunt against Bass Reeves started. And there was one incident from 1884 that the Attorney General could try to use to bring Reeves down. Bass Reeves is out in a dead pool with a bunch of Warrens chasing down so many outlaws that he is traveling with a crew large enough that it requires its own cook. That cook was a man who went by the name of William Leach. One day, while resting at camp, Leach and Reeves get into an argument that they have in full sight and presence of all other crew members who would later give varying testimonies as to what the argument was about, or whether it was even serious or just playful banter between two guys. Either way, there was definitely a lengthy discussion between Reeves and Leach, and all the while, Reeves was trying to clear a .45 caliber round that got stuck in the chamber of a rifle that didn't shoot .45 caliber rounds. He was trying to clear a bullet out of a rifle, a bullet that got stuck. You understand? And Reeves was using a knife to try and dislodge the bullet while talking to Leach, and one accidental discharge later, Leach was shot. All witnesses later testified that this was an accident and that Bass Reeves immediately performed first aid and tried to keep Leach alive long enough so that a doctor could arrive, but the cook died. Leach died. Reeves then reported the incident, and he never went on the run, for he and all who were present knew and agreed that this was an accident, not a crime. 2 years later, the Attorney General decides to revise this history and charge Bass Reeves with murder, which meant that he could stick Reeves in jail in between many court dates, keep him from working, keep him locked up for more than half a year, while also making him pay for a bunch of legal fees. In the end, Bass Reeves was found innocent again because it was an accident, and he was, everybody agreed. But the legal battle had crippled him and his family financially. Bass Reeves had to sell his 8-room mansion that he very literally had risked his life for in the line of duty for over 30 years, and he and his family had to relocate to a small home somewhere outside of town, ready to leave the corrupt city life behind. Or so you would think. Even after Bass Reeves got stabbed in the back by the system he had served, he returned to duty because that's the type of man he was. A man so loyal to justice that he was willing to bring in his own son and is willing to serve a system that he knows is corrupt because he believes that the cause is greater than its rotten individuals. And so Bass Reeves continued to serve the law until he was 69 years old, and even then he only quit due to a kidney issue that would eventually lead to his death 2 years later at age 71 in the year 1910, and thus ended the life of the greatest lawman of all time.